Bona tarda a tothom. L'Associació Nomarcada us dà la benvinguda a aquesta xerrada de Dana Roemling e dell'Università di Birmingham e l'Università di Helsinki sopra la linguistica forense amb il títol Words as Evidence as Introduction to Forensic Linguistics, che introdueix aquesta disciplina gli studi del linguatge applicat al context forense. L'Associació Marcada està formada per estudiants del grau de lingüística i d'altra carrera i volem promoure l'interès per la lingüística, l'estudi della llengua i ser un espai de divulgació científica en el nostre camp. Amb aquest propòsit organitzem activitats com xerrades, club de lectura i d'altres. Tots els membres estem a vostra disposició per resoldre qualsevol mena de dubte que tingueu respecte i estem aquí per escoltar suggeriments. Podeu contactar amb nosaltres per correu nomarcada@gmail.com o visitar la nostra xarxa social nomarcada a Twitter e Instagram. Us presentaré breument Dana Roemling. Dana actualment està doctorant a l'Universitat de Birmingham, va estudiar el grau d'Estudis Finesos i Anglesos a la Universitat de Colònia, un màster de lingüística a la Universitat de Düsseldorf i un màster de recerca social a la Universitat de Birmingham i ara està fent investigació en qualitat de visitant a la Universitat de Helsinki. La seva recerca se centra principalment en la lingüística forense i el llenguatge i la llei. Dins la lingüística forense treballa tant en l'anàlisi com ara en la perfilació de l'autoria. Però també té interès per altres àrees com ara l'anàlisi de notes de suïcidi. Dins del llenguatge i la llei s'interessa per la interpretació de la llei i per el poder i l'identitat en el discurs legal. Dana també té interès per altres vessants de la sociolingüística, especialment dialectologia, lingüística de corpus i lingüística queer. I will switch in English to introduce our association and the investigator we have the pleasure to have today as a speaker. The Nomarcada Association welcomes you to this seminar, Words as Evidence, an Introduction to Forensic Linguistics by Dana Roemling, University of Birmingham and Helsinki. This talk introduces forensic linguistics, the study of language relevant to the forensic context. And now I would like to introduce briefly our speaker, Dana Roemling. Dana is a doctoral researcher at the University of Birmingham working on authorship profiling. They hold a BA in Finnish and English studies from the University of Cologne and MA in linguistics from the University of Düsseldorf and an MA in social research from the University of Birmingham. They are a visiting researcher at the University of Helsinki. Dana's research interests are in forensic linguistics, language, and law. Within forensic linguistics, they work on authorship, both analysis and profiling, but are also interested in other areas such as suicide note analysis. Within language and law, they're interested in statutory interpretation and power and identity in the legal discourse. Dan is also interested in broader areas of sociolinguistics, especially dialectology, corpus linguistics, and lavender linguistics. And now I would like to give the floor to Dana.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the introduction, which is a lot longer than I'm used to. Also, thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here virtually. I am in the north of Finland at the moment, so I hope this works out to stream this to Spain. You need to give me permission to share the screen so I can show you my slides. Excellent. Yes, that looks good. Right. I guess we can start off right away then with the introduction, because I don't really need to say anything else about myself now. So the plan for today that I have is that I'll give you a very general introduction to what forensic linguistics is. We'll start off with a little venture into language and law, so you've heard of that as well. And then I'll talk mainly about authorship analysis. I'll talk about the cases of Timothy Evans and Derek Bentley, what the basics are that we have in authorship analysis. And in the end, I'll talk a bit about the work that I'm doing for my PhD in authorship profiling. So we'll have a look at a ransom note and how we can use dialectology in forensic linguistics. Now, obviously, given this topic, I don't think any one of you will be surprised, but I will be mentioning criminal cases. There's mention of kidnapping. I think we have a murder case. So just in case you weren't aware of this and this is surprising to you, just to know that this is coming up. And if you don't feel that's something you want to listen to today, that's obviously absolutely fine. But let's jump right into forensic linguistics. So very generally, we define forensic linguistics as the intersection of language with legal or investigative contexts. So whenever language is relevant to something that we do in law or to something that is, for instance, in a criminal case, for example, if the language is evidence itself, then we're talking about forensic linguistics. So it is a very specialist field that is closely linked to practical work of law enforcement, criminal investigators, prosecutors, judges, anyone within these kinds of contexts. It is so far mainly established in English-speaking countries, but there is a growing area of research in many other jurisdictions. So I'll have a slide at the very end of some notes of where you could look at forensic linguistics in Spain, for example. I'm aware it's not Catalan, but you know, it's a small field, so we need to be happy about anything that we can get at this point. But yeah, we're growing, and I hope that this talk will get some more people interested to join us. Usually what happens in forensic linguistics is that we see a sort of two-way split between the two main areas within forensic linguistics. And on the one hand, that is language as evidence or language in the investigative process. So for example, if the police are interested in a linguistic piece of evidence. So this could be a ransom note or text messages in a murder investigation. On the other hand, we have the language of the law or the language within the legal process. So an example of that is usually statutory interpretation. So if you have a law given from a state and you want to figure out what that law means, you might think, okay, I speak the language, this should be fine. But often we find that these things are not as trivial as speaking a language. Or what you could also be interested in is looking at the influence of power and hierarchy in court. You can imagine that a judge holds more power in this kind of context. So what does that mean for the language that gets spoken in court? I tried to find a Spanish statute that I could use or a Catalan statute, but we're going to deal with English because my Spanish/Catalan is so bad that I didn't want to put you through that. So the idea is, this is one of the UK statutes on murder. And if you read this, you're like, well, yeah, I have an idea of what this means, sort of a vague understanding of if someone murders someone, then this law should apply. But what does that mean? What do the words in this statute convey to you? So for example, if you look at any reasonable creature, whatever that is. So this is the kind of things that you could be interested in when you look at statutory interpretation. Admittedly, this is not the most exciting example that I have. I think the next one is going to be a bit better. So just to sort of bring the divide home, in language as evidence, we usually look at the application of linguistics to criminal cases or investigations. So this is the realm of authorship analysis, or for example, looking at threatening communications. Whereas in language of the law or language and law, we look at laws, guidelines, how we could come up with contracts, for example, how we translate in the EU, because everything in the EU is in all of the languages usually. So what does that mean legally if we have all these translations? And also just generally, what's the big difference between how, quote, normal people speak, how lawyers speak? So how can we understand legalese, for example? And the case that I've brought you for language and law is quite a famous one in this kind of niche field that we're in. And I think it's quite a brilliant one. And it is about perjury. So perjury generally means that you are lying under oath. So you say, I'm not going to lie, I swear to God. But then because you're in court, you still lie, and that's then perjury. So it's not the lie itself that's punishable. It is when you've sworn an oath that you're not going to lie, and then you lie. That's committing the crime. And we're looking at a case from the US, which is a Supreme Court case where someone, well, depending on your view of things, has lied or has not lied. So the law for this, and this is going to look like a lot, but I'll break it down. So this is the law that defines what perjury is. You don't have to read this. I'll point out the important bits. So this code, the 1621 of the US code, says that if you've taken an oath that you will testify truly, and then contrary to this oath, state something that you do not believe to be true, you're committing perjury. So the important bits are willfully and contrary to an oath you have taken to say something that you don't believe to be true. So the key things here is you actually have to believe or know that something is untrue. So if you believe it's true and you say it in court, then it's a mistake and you've not committed perjury. And it must concern a material matter of the case. So if you, I don't know, forget the color of the car that was parked outside and this is not important to the case, then okay, you may have lied under oath, but it's not something that is concerning the case, really. Now, the case I have for you is the case of Bronston against the United States, which was decided in 1973. So it was a lower court case and went up to the Supreme Court because the people could not decide whether or not Bronston had actually lied under oath. And the relevant conversation that happened in court was that Bronston was questioned about bank accounts that he and or his company had in Switzerland. And he says, so the lawyer says, do you have any bank accounts in Swiss banks, Mr. Bronston? No. Have you ever had one? The company had an account there for about 6 months. And then the lawyer continues, do you have any nominees? So other people who have bank accounts in Swiss banks? No. Now, the bit that you need to know is that, in fact, Mr. Bronston did have an account in a Swiss bank before this court conversation. The question arises now, and you see this very clearly, that when he's asked, have you ever had an account in a Swiss bank? He sort of does not answer the question and says, well, the company had an account there. And you might infer from the company had an account there that, well, only the company had an account and I did not have an account. But that's not what he said. So people were arguing that he was lying by omitting and not answering the question. Now, in a setting where we would be in one room, I'd ask you to say, you know, what were your thoughts on this? And maybe we can do this in the end, but I'll give you the solution to the case. What the judges in the Supreme Court said, what happened was they decided that Mr. Bronston, in fact, had not lied, even though he had failed to rely all information. So they said, well, he didn't say anything that was untrue. The company had an account there. He just didn't say all the things and didn't answer the question. But the court argued that what should have happened is that the prosecutor, so the lawyer, should have asked a follow-up question to say, okay, by saying the company had an account, do you mean that you did not have an account? But that's not what happened. So you can imagine that this was quite a big decision, because that meant that if you just didn't answer questions, you wouldn't be liable for perjury because you didn't convey any untrue information. So usually when I give these kinds of introductions, people are like, okay, I'm interested in the forensic bit, not so much the language and law bit. But I think this case quite nicely says to you, okay, even in a courtroom, even in the legal setting, language is so incredibly important that it's worth exploring, even if you usually wouldn't be interested in legal matters. But let's get back to the forensic linguistics, to the sort of Criminal Minds TV show things. One thing I need to point out before I go into the full forensic linguistics thing is that we're not talking about forensic phonetics here. So usually when you study linguistics, phonetics and phonology is a part of that. So it's part of the whole of the degree that you're doing. But within the forensic setting, we usually say that these are two separate disciplines. So forensic linguistics is focusing on written text, and anything could be a forensic text. So if you, I don't know, forget your shopping list at a murder scene, that might become a forensic text if, you know, we think that we could find the murderer through that shopping list. And within forensic linguistics, any area can be relevant. So it might be that we're looking at pragmatics, as we just did with the legal case, where we looked at the inference that the sentence has brought us. We could be looking at syntax, and you'll see a lot of the examples of which of these areas are important. But anything that is focusing on spoken data is usually within the realm of forensic phonetics. So that means if we have written data, we're in linguistics. If we have anything spoken, we're in phonetics. And this is because the methods that we have in these two disciplines are quite different. And you can imagine if you've ever watched a show like, I don't know, Criminal Minds, NCIS, when they do these kinds of analysis with the little sound waves, that's a very technical thing to do. So not something that I can do with staring at language, as I would maybe describe doing forensic linguistics. So if that's what you're interested in, I can give you some pointers later on, but this is not what I can give my expertise on because I'm not a forensic phonetician. So we're looking at forensic linguistics today. And the big area within forensic linguistics has always been authorship analysis. In authorship analysis, we're interested in figuring out who wrote something. Who is the author of a text? When was it written? Was the text translated? Was there maybe more than one author? These are the kind of typical things that come up. And you can imagine a lot of criminal or even civil contexts where this might be interesting. The ransom note that is unknown in its authorship is a very classic example, but we could also look at something, say, all of you, including me, have written emails to someone, and then an anonymous email comes up and we want to compare which of us is the most likely author of that unknown email. Very famous examples of authorship across the time are the Bible. There's lots of research on when it was written, how many authors there were, if the Apocrypha are actually, you know, written by the same people that have written the Bible. So there's lots of discussion about this. Also very famously, Shakespeare is an area where people are very interested in who wrote it, if it was multiple authors, whether or not all of the things that happen to have the name Shakespeare on it can actually be attributed to the person that we think Shakespeare has been. There are a couple of others, the Bixby Letter, the Federalist Papers, maybe a bit more niche, but then again, Jack the Ripper is probably something that people have heard of. And there's a lot of, because of the media attention the cases got at the time, there was a lot of communication to the police, and there's lots of questions still remaining, I would argue, about which of all of these letters were actually by the murderer that we tend to call Jack the Ripper. Now, very often historically, this was part of literary studies and not part of linguistics. So that's only a fairly recent development that we're looking at this in a linguistic and then in a forensic linguistic context, even though we have a lot more methods now than I would claim literary studies has. Now, before we can do any kind of authorship analysis, we need to look at a couple of preliminary sort of basics before we can go into it. So the first thing, if we have a text, a question document is usually what we call it. Before we can analyze the question document, we need to figure out, do we have enough data? This is usually, especially in forensic settings, quite a tricky question because we need at least a reasonable amount of data to be able to do any kind of analysis. So imagine the police coming to you saying, okay, we have these 3 WhatsApp messages. Can you tell us who the author is? And then usually what happens is that you say, well, that's not enough for me to do any kind of linguistic analysis. I could maybe give you an educated guess about the author, but you need, and it's hard to define a threshold here to say like, okay, you always need, I don't know, X number of words, but you'll have to look at the case and consider, do we know enough? Is there enough space for linguistic features to come up so that we can do any kind of analysis? The other question that you need to ask yourself before any kind of analysis is, are we sure that this was authored by one person, or is there influence from other people that we see in the text? Because not necessarily because we then need to say, okay, I can't answer this, but because we need to maybe adapt our methodology. Because usually what happens is that we look at the text as a whole, and if we don't know if all of the paragraphs in the text have been written by one person, we can't do the same things in analysis that we would like to do maybe if we had one clear author. And the last thing, maybe not so much to not do an analysis, but good to know is always, was the text in any way copy edited? You can imagine that something like a newspaper article is very heavily copy edited. So that means all of the interesting features that I might want to look at from a linguistic point of view are probably edited out and I can't use them anymore. Or if you use predictive writing, or your phone, completes your sentences for you, or nowadays, if AI completes the sentences for you, that will change how you use language. And that will mean that at least we need to be aware of this when we do any kind of analysis. Now, authorship analysis has 3 subdisciplines, and we'll talk about 2 of them today in a bit more detail. The first one is authorship attribution, where we look at the question, which of these is the most likely candidate author? And what that means is we have a question document and we have a pool of suspects. And for this pool of suspects, we want to know who is the most likely person who wrote this. That means that in this kind of setting, we're not doing a comparison from the unknown text to all people in the world, because we couldn't reliably do this kind of analysis. But usually what happens is that the police say, okay, out of all of the people in the world, we think that the murder victim's uncle, husband, brother, and next door neighbor are the 4 people that could have been the person who has written this text. And then you can do a comparison with material from these different people to say, okay, most likely this is the person that has authored the text. The next bit within authorship analysis is authorship verification, where we look at the question, was it the same author who has authored the question document? So again, we have something where we don't know who authored it, and we have a suspect in mind. So it's not like a one-to-many, but a one-to-one mapping that we're interested in. And then we see if we can figure out if the linguistic features used in both of these would be a match, and that we can say, okay, probably these have been authored by the same person. The last bit is authorship profiling. And this is a bit different from authorship attribution and verification, because we're looking at what type of author has authored a text. So again, we have a question document, but what we don't have is a pool of suspect or any comparison material. But what we do have is knowledge about sociolinguistic groups. So we know that in this case, the groups in green, yellow, and purple have different ways of using language and use different linguistic features. And then we can see whether our question document has features that can be found in any of these groups. And then we can maybe say, okay, I'm fairly certain that the author of this text is someone who belongs to, in this case, the purple group. To actually get into a bit of linguistic data, I'm going to talk about the case of Timothy Evans, which happened at 10 Rillington Place in the UK. A bit of background before I get into the linguistic material. Timothy had a difficult childhood. He is disabled, or he was disabled, and he is functionally illiterate, which is going to be a relevant factor for the linguistic analysis that we're going to do. He's married, and his marriage is described as quarrelsome. So lots of fights happening in this marriage. And it's said that he abused alcohol to some degree. And at some point in this story, his wife dies under somewhat mysterious circumstances, presumably while she was seeking an abortion because they could not afford to have a second child. Now, at this point, we don't have bodies, but Evans is taken into custody for the murder of his wife and daughter because they have been missing. When he is taken into custody, he claims that he killed his wife by giving her something in a bottle for the abortion. Now, obviously, the police is very interested in this because they think they have solved the case already. Evans then later changes his story and explains that actually he didn't give his wife a bottle, he just made that up, and it's actually his neighbor who is involved in the process of the abortion and potentially in the death. The important bit is that Evans never testified that he killed his daughter. Later on in the investigation, the remains, the bodies of his wife and daughter, are found together in a place that Evans did not have physical access to. Both of them were strangled. Evans is then informed, while in custody, of these circumstances, and allegedly, so the police say, Evans confesses to the murder of his wife and daughter. He is subsequently charged, found guilty, and hanged based on these statements. And now we're going to look at these police statements that Timothy Evans presumably told the police, has written down for the police. And then we'll see why we think now that these are actually not statements that he has authored himself. So this is the first bit. I asked her what she was going to do with the baby. So she said she was going to take the baby down to Brighton with her. So I said it would be a good job and a lot of worry off my mind. So I went to work as usual. So when I came home at night, I just put the kettle on, I sat down. My wife walked in, and so I said, I thought you was going to Brighton. She said, what for you to have a good time. Now from this, and I know this has been fast, but you don't necessarily need to understand all of this. For the point that I'm trying to make is, this feels very much like a narration. If you imagine that you're telling your friend what you did on the weekend, this is maybe how this would look. It's one string of thought where you go from, okay, this happened, and then I did this because of that. All fine. Now we get to the second bit of the statement that Evans allegedly authored. And I'll point out the important bits. If you want to read through that, that's fine. And I can also share the slides later on if you want to look at this in a bit more detail. But here, there are a couple of features where you start to think, okay, we know that Evans is illiterate, so he could not have read the statements that he signed. And also this feels kind of strange in the way this is doing the narration. And the important bits are in red here. So if you read the sentence, about the beginning of October, my wife, Beryl Susan Evans. And now ask yourself, if you tell someone a story where you say, my wife or my husband, do you then include their full name, including their second first name? Usually I would argue you don't, unless maybe you are in a police station and this is a very weird context where they made you say the full name of your spouse. But in a normal narration, this is not what happens. Another sign that at least there's not just one author to these statements is the use of the word then. So she then told me, then she bought, then she said, then she said. We have found through corpus analysis that this is actually a feature that gets used by police officers incredibly often. This is because they need to establish the chronology of the timeline, and they do that by inserting the word then in a lot of places. But it's not something that a regular person does when they tell you about events that have happened. And the last bit, at least in this piece of the statement, is that we see what we have called an answer to an unasked question. So when you look at the sentence with the last red underline, on the Sunday morning, that would be the 6th of November, she told me that. Now, if you were in a normal narration, you wouldn't necessarily weirdly insert the date of when something was happening, especially not in this kind of way. So all of these factors point us to the idea that maybe even if Evans confessed to the murders of his wife and daughter, these statements were not authored by himself. Because we see quite a lot of language that is at least unusual and that has subsequently been termed police speech. Now, you might ask, okay, whether or not these statements were written down by police officers or by Evans doesn't really make a big difference. But the thing is that the police said that these are the words of Timothy Evans. And if someone is hanged based on these statements, I would rather that they actually authored these statements themselves before being hanged for their crime that they maybe did not commit. So the authorship of these are still disputed, but there has been some development in the case, if you will. So a couple of years later, John Christie, who is the neighbor, is charged with murder in 8 counts because the police discovered more bodies, not just the ones from his wife and from Evans' wife and daughter, in his flat and garden. And that's when the police start to question, okay, maybe if there is a serial killer in this neighborhood, Evans was not the one who originally killed his wife and daughter. So Christie is then hanged for the murders, and years of investigation follow to ascertain whether or not Evans did in fact kill his wife and daughter. And he's then pardoned in 1966, which is nice, but obviously doesn't help him very much because they hanged him. An inquiry in 2004, so 50 years later, stated that they cannot fully clear Evans because that would cost the state too much money. So he still remains to be sentenced and then pardoned for the crime of killing his wife and daughter. If there's anything good about this case, other than that we've learned quite a bit about linguistics, is that the UK abolished the death penalty for murder in 1965. And this case and 2 other cases are the reason why this reform was made. So forensic linguistics was actually quite a big part of changing how law works in the UK. That being said, it wasn't called forensic linguistics at the time. That's a name that came a bit later. The other case that was influential for the abolishment of capital punishment was the case of Derek Bentley. And if you're interested in that, there is a movie made about this, which is called Let Him Have It. So if you don't know what to do later tonight, this might be the thing. I'll give you a very quick summary of what happened in the case. 2 youths are being chased by the police. One of them has a gun, and the other one, who does not have the gun, says, "Let him have it." Now, the question in this case was, did he mean shoot the police officer, or did he mean give him the gun? And the police quite clearly understood this as shoot the police officer, but this is maybe not what you initially thought about this. And I'm not going to spoil the ending of this movie if you're going to watch it or if you want to read about the case on Wikipedia. But it's the other big case for forensic linguistics where the language that was important for the evidence here later got analyzed, and doubts arise as to whether or not convictions made in these cases were actually correct. So going back to just forensic linguistics, what is authorship? Generally, that means being the author of a linguistic work, but in forensics, we usually mean that to determine the author. So figuring out who the author of a text is. This is based on a lot of diverse linguistic factors, and it's usually based on the idea of an idiolect. And what we mean by that is an individual set of linguistic features. We also sometimes see people use linguistic fingerprint, and I've put the asterisks here in front of it because in forensic linguistics, we don't use it. And the reason for that is that we think it says that we are very certain about the results of our work, and we usually can't be as certain as people are about fingerprint analysis. So that's why we hesitate to say linguistic fingerprint. But if the metaphor helps you to understand what we are doing, then maybe imagine that you sort of leave traces in your language, because every one of us has individual features of how they use language. So what is the basic assumption for authorship analysis that we need to be able to do any kind of analysis? So the idea is that every native speaker has their own and distinct version of how they do language, how they speak and write. And this is their idiolect. You've heard of dialect, you've heard of sociolect. So idiolect is just the same kind of concept, but applied to one person. So the idea is that this idiolect will come out when people use language. So they have distinctive choices that they make in texts, for example, that we can use to make a linguistic analysis. Now, the sort of basic assumption here is that although any one of us could use any word at any time, maybe bearing any kind of grammatical constraints, we in fact do not do that. So even though I could use all of the words to explain to you what idiolect is, I in fact use the same words almost every time now I explain what idiolect is. So I have preferences of words that I use when I do this. So what does that mean? It means that when we do authorship analysis, we do not compare to all of the authors in the world. Usually we have a set of authors that we are doing an analysis with. And we're trying to select or deselect authors based on these idiolectal choices that people make. So we assume that there's enough linguistic variation between authors that allow us to say, okay, this question document was more likely authored by A and not by B, given how they use language. So there's been quite a development in recent years, whether we can actually claim that every person on the planet has an idiolect. So people have started to opt for different ways of calling this thing. So for example, Marco et al. Say that rather this variation is an individual style, which sort of gets away from it is 100% unique, because people assumed, especially police officers, then thought that we are always 100% linguistically unique, and that's not what's happening. Grant and MacLeod say that they think this kind of variation is actually not an idiolect, but how we perform our identity when we write a text, for example. And Grief in 2023 said that actually it's not an idiolect or an individual person's fingerprint, if you will, but it is their register. So each and every one of us has different registers of how to do language, and that's what we're actually seeing, rather than idiosyncratic, super unique features. One of the most recent things that we've looked at is that we use words in certain functions. So, for example, we can look at how often I use the word that while I give this presentation. And from that, you can do sort of an authorship profile of me and figure out whether or not I did a different talk that you might look at in writing. And this is because I use that in a certain function every time that I use it. Now, the way this works is not that every time I use the word that, come up with the whole sentence structure around the word, but that I have units of words, so not just one word, but several words at a time that are sort of conventionalized, that I always use next to each other. And these get stored in my brain as a grammar that I use. And what we see as idiolectal style is actually differences in these kinds of grammars. Now, regardless of how you want to call this, the reason why I'm telling you this is because we need it. Because if we don't assume that we can individuate people by their language use, then authorship analysis doesn't work. So that's why there's quite a big discussion about how do we call this? How are we certain that people, in fact, are linguistically quite diverse? Then when we do our kind of work, we need to also keep in mind that we can't often compare the things that the police give us. So say I have a note that is left next to a murder victim, but all the things that the police give me to do the comparison, to do the authorship analysis, are academic papers. Then these genres are so different that I can't make any good guesses because people will in fact not be as consistent as we would like them to be. So quite recently, we've looked into if people are consistent throughout what they do linguistically, and it turns out they are not as stable in their language use as we would like them to be. So I might type the same way when I write WhatsApp and emails, but Marianna, for example, might differ in WhatsApp and emails, but then be consistent in emails and academic texts, making this up. And this means that authors are show quite a lot of variation in the features that they are consistent with. Unfortunately for authorship analysis, obviously this is great in a sort of linguistic news, but we would like people to be more consistent because that would make our life easier as forensic linguists. Now, there are two big branches of authorship methodologies. On the one hand, we have stylometry, and on the other hand, we have stylistics. And the basic idea between the two is that one of them is quantitative and the other one is more qualitative. So one is often done computationally, one is often done manually. So in the kind of computational analysis, you count anything that you can get your hands on. So for example, you look at how long are the words in the text, how often do people repeat words when they are writing? So anything that you can do in a kind of statistical way, that's what goes into the left-hand side here. On the right side, you have something that you can sort of pick out when you look at the page. So the analysis of stylistic variables. That means, do you see that, for example, an author always puts a space before their interpunctuation? That might be something that the computational side doesn't pick up, but that's something that is very relevant when you do a sort of manual analysis. Oftentimes in the discipline, at least up to now, we've seen a sort of divide between the two. So you either do the left one or the right one. But we're getting to the point where people realize that actually we usually need both of them. And the reason for that often depends on the amount of data that we have. You can imagine that if the police give me 100 WhatsApp messages, I might try to do statistics on them. But if I have just a handful of words, I can't really count things. So I end up doing the sort of manual analysis. Whereas if I'm interested in whether or not a famous author has a ghostwriter, then I can go into the more computational side. If this is at all interesting to you, I very much recommend looking into the paper that Grant and Grief have written about the Starbucks case, not related to the coffee company, where they discuss the sort of methodological questions about authorship analysis. Now, the concept that I've mentioned, so for example, the space before interpunctuation, is the idea of markedness, so something that we can pick out as a sort of unique or at least individual feature of language. So if I always do this, always do the space before my comma, then this is in my grammar, but it might not be in your grammar. And that's why we can make an assumption about whether or not I authored the text. And now I hope this works out. I hope you can speak to me, because what I would like you to do is tell me, for this message, who is the most likely author between A and B? So have a look, read through these, and then when you're ready, tell me something, why one of these is the more likely author.
There is anyone that would like to guess?
I'm not expecting any, full-blown analysis here. Just if there's something that you think says this is author A or this is author B. And I think you can also, you don't need to speak English if that's uncomfortable.
Good afternoon. My guess would be author B, would be
Okay.
the author, and the reasoning I guess is I can see a bit more correct punctuation on the author, more like corresponding to the original rather than the author A. For example, in the second paragraph of author A, there's no mark or punctuation at all. There is no on purpose.
So I thought maybe author A, because author A uses talking about punctuation, uses a hyphen, which I think is quite not marked, but not the standard punctuation. So to me that pops out, and also combines numbers the same way the text does. Like gotta go to, that's what the example says, and then author A also does that. Author A also does 2 pieces instead of 3, and I think kind of they use less capitals than author B, which is kind of what I'm seeing in the first text message. I don't know. Anyone else? Okay.
I also think it's author A because it's not just hyphens, it's also the hyphen after the exclamation mark with exactly the space, which is like the original. And then also the apostrophes. Like they are also missing in author A, but they are present most of the time of the B, although no apostrophe is full in the first of the text. So I say it's author A.
I am adding to the author A too because of X and also, as we can see here, and who thanks and okay, cool. There's more here. I think it's more author A. So let's see if we got it.
Yes. So to be clear, I have made this example up to have something that is very short that I can give you to sort of do this kind of thing in a talk. Usually I would say if this was an actual case, I'd say I don't have enough to be sure. But I agree with the author A analysis. So I think the way that the person uses numbers, so instead of the TO to use the to, and the hyphen, at least the space hyphen space is something that I would say, at least for the small sample that I've given you, would point me towards author A. Obviously, I've tried to pick some features for author B that would also point you to author B, so that there's some, resemblance. Because usually what happens in these cases is that it's not very straightforward. So I would say here there are a couple of great markers, but that's usually not what happens. So there's oftentimes the fact that you find something in the question document that corresponds to A, and then you find something else that corresponds to B. And then you still should make a good case for why you decide for A or for B. So the sort of take-home message from this case is that if you were asked to do this kind of analysis, it would be very important to say, okay, I can't just list why I think it's author A. I should also list why I think it's author B, or why it could be author B, but why I end up saying it is A, because, I don't know, the consistency, or this is more marked in author A. But it's important to sort of look at both sides and not just focus on, okay, I think it's A, so I'll focus all the stuff that I'm writing on just author A. That's not how a good report should look. And if you're interested in this case, or in a case that's very similar to this, there's a paper by Tim Grant about the case of Amanda Burks. I'll put it in the slides when I send the slides over. Where this kind of analysis was done, but in a much larger scale. So where someone took over a murder victim's phone, or that was what the police was thinking. So there was quite a big analysis of the to and the for and the interpunctuation, so lots of neat little details to look at. Okay. Moving back to authorship analysis as a whole, because I want to move on and talk a bit about authorship profiling for the last bit. So, as I said, authorship profiling is about what type of author authored a text. So what we are trying to do is we want to make an inference, a guess about characteristics of an author just by looking at the language that they're using. So, for example, can we tell by the text how old someone was, what their gender is, or if there are any influences of their first language that we can see in the text? And this is, again, I'm sorry I make you stand up so much, Mariana. This is a ransom note. And what I would like you to do is read through this and give me a profile of the author. Now, anything you can think of that is interesting about this case. And if you know the case, let the others have some fun with it to, figure out.
So I think, I'm not too sure, but I think this note has to be written based like on a person that has some kind of education, and that maybe is trying to pretend they haven't received that education, because it does seem to have some like kind of mistakes, like can with a K, cops with a K, and daughter with 2 T's, but they don't really seem to be like systematic. Like there's those 3 mistakes, which to me kind of, it seems like you're pretending to make those mistakes so as to pretend you're not as educated as you are. But then there are some things that are done right, like for example, 10,000, the comma in the right place and stuff that to me kind of points like that you do have some education, you're just trying to fake it. Like also the excessive like exclamation points maybe trying to pretend to, I don't know, yeah, I think this is someone in terms of education that has received some education, but is trying to pretend they didn't, or at least they have received, trying to pretend they received a less, like lower level of education than they have.
Anything else that you think is interesting before I answer?
Yeah, so before she talks, I would have said that it was a speaker of a Slavic language. I would have been my wild guess. Because I see some articles missing, some Lincoln articles that are missing as well. But I think she convinced me that it's realistic. So it's really someone pretending to sound foreign.
Yes, I agree too. Here, the person that wrote this wanted to convince that he came from a precise dialect. So let's see if we got it in this case too.
Yes. So you very rightly pointed out that the person misspelled can, cops, and daughter. However, you also noted that they spelled a lot of very complicated things correctly, especially if you think that the person thinks that any word that starts with k, as in cops or can, would need the k, then they weren't very consistent because cash, corner, come, and Carlson are also spelled correctly. So very good on you to do this analysis, because usually what happens when I do this case is that people are like, yeah, I think they are uneducated. And then after some questions, we get to, okay, maybe that's someone who's pretending to not know how to spell. I love this case so much, and Mariana knows this because I've used this case before. The bit that solved the case was not the education analysis that you've just done, but it was the devil's strip. You might have read this and thought to yourself, I don't know what that is, and I didn't either when I first read this. But what happened was that when the linguist who was involved in the case, who got asked to consult on this case, saw this, he said, well, do you have on your list of suspects someone from Akron in Ohio? Because only in northeastern Ohio would people use the phrase the devil's strip. Now, the police were like, this is not how this works. I mean, we've seen linguists work. This is not what you can usually tell us. But he was like, no, actually, for this case, I can, because it's quite a special case. So if you ever wondered what the devil's strip is, it is this patch of grass between the street and the sidewalk. And according to the Dictionary of American Regional English, only people, or chiefly people in northeastern Ohio, use the devil's strip to refer to this patch of grass. Obviously, this is something you need to know, or at least you need to have an intuition about, that this might be a regional item. But in this case, that meant that they indeed only had one suspect who fit this description, which then led to the case being solved. Which I still think is absolutely amazing, because this sounds very much like an episode of NCIS where they, I don't know, find some weird mosquito blot that was only ever used in Florida. I don't know, something like that. But, you know, I love to use it for teaching, because I think it explains so well how incredibly important even the tiniest bit of language can be for cases like this. So, as you've seen from this ransom note, we determined the characteristics, in this case, their regional origin of the author, looking at how they use language. And then in turn, we could narrow down the pool of suspects. We usually do this through either what Nini here calls the analysis of salient linguistic features, or the analysis of writing style. And basically what he means by that is the distinction that you already know about, which is the distinction between kind of the computational and quantitative side of things and the manual or qualitative side of things. So what we've just done is the analysis of salient linguistic features. We looked at it and we picked out the things that we thought were marked or were interesting. And if we do the analysis of writing style, we treat the text as a whole and try to do some register or genre analysis. Now, this usually doesn't work for texts that are this short, but these are the two main branches. And I bring this up because the project that I'm working on for my PhD is trying to combine these two things. So I'm trying to do the same thing as with the devil strip example, but for German or for the German-speaking area. So can I find out where the author of, for example, a text message is from based on how much dialect they use, how they write their, I don't know, Facebook messages, for example. And I do this with a social media corpus. And I think this is quite cool because usually, or oftentimes in linguistics, you might work with data that is elicited or that's, quite a small corpus. But just to say that there's quite a lot of options for you to use social media data if you want to do linguistics, and especially if you want to do forensic linguistics. So the app Yodel, I don't know if that's a thing in Spain, but it's definitely in the German-speaking area and here in Finland. The absolute cool thing about this app, it looks a bit like Twitter or X, is that you can only interact with people that are close around your own location. The downside of this thing is that we don't have accounts or profiles. So people think that they're anonymous, but they can only anonymously interact with people that are in their town, in their city, for example. It's quite a big corpus that was collected in 2017. It has 240 million tokens, and it features Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, but the data is skewed towards Germany. Now, this is a classic example of what the messages in this corpus look like. Semester break, barbecue sleep, barbecue pub sleep, repeat. And from this, you can sort of infer that this is quite an informal medium, as you would have guessed from social media. People use it to pass time, to date, to find friends. So that's the kind of language that you will see in this. Now, the idea is that if I can use this social media corpus that looks like Twitter, and see that there's regional distribution, then I can use it as a reference tool, the same way that the linguist Roger Schei used the regional dictionary of American English to figure out where people use the phrase the devil strip. So the first thing I did for this corpus was to figure out if there's regional variation. So I've looked at, on the left, you see to see or to watch, the verb, and how people use it in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And you see that the purple, the first one, is more prevalent in the south, and the green is more prevalent in the north. And I usually include the right example, which means trash can, just because I like the Austrian variant so much. And you can see that it clusters quite nicely that Mistkübel, the second one, gets used in Austria. And you can look at more interesting dialectal items. So usually in dialectology, we often talk about food. And because I'm German and this is German-speaking data, I'm talking about bread. This is the word for bread roll. On the left, you see that Semmel, the second one in green, is more prevalent in Austria and Bavaria, which form a dialect continuum. And Wegli, in this specific spelling, is quite prevalent in Switzerland. So if you were to write a ransom note and include words for bread roll, we might be able to figure out where you're from. Now, I admit these are maybe not the words that you expect in a ransom note, but they prove the point that you can use social media data to have as a reference in these kinds of investigation. And this is quite important because, yes, we have dialect dictionaries, but the way we use language on social media might be quite different than, I don't know, a handwritten ransom note. But with the rise of social media, we obviously also see more crime that happens on the internet, and where we are linguistically a lot closer to Twitter or Yodel than we would be to any kind of standard corpus that has been used previously. Now, how can I make this useful in a forensic kind of case? So can I narrow down the same way, pinpoint on a map where someone's from? For example, I've tried to do this for north-south and east-west, and granted, again, I don't think people will talk about their A-levels, their university entrance examinations in their answer note, or maybe they will because they want to, you know, extort better grades for their A-levels, I don't know. But if they use Matura, the second variable here on the left, then they would more likely be from Switzerland and Austria. I've tried to do space traveler, astronaut, cosmonaut, but there is not quite a neat east-west split. Even though we expect that, given the former inner German border, linguistically, we don't see that as much. And the most likely reason for this is that the people who use Yodel are quite young. So the majority of people is under 30. So the majority of people have never lived in a separated state of Germany. So that their language sort of doesn't show this anymore is what we would actually expect. Now, these are words that are more likely to come up in a ransom note. So the first one means January, and there's a quite standard version of this for Austrian German. And you can imagine someone saying, you know, bring the money until the end of January or something like that. So this would be something that could narrow down the list of our suspects. Now, bearing in mind, this is also quite an obvious thing. So if you speak German, when someone uses the word Jänner, the Austrian variant, you immediately think of Austria because it's quite marked. So it might be that someone is actually using this to obfuscate that they are not indeed from Austria, the same way that the author in the ransom note from the US tried to fool us that they're not as educated as they are. The variable on the right is something like a corner shop or a kiosk, and the purple variant, the Späti, is something that is very prevalent for Berlin. So we see that this clusters to the east quite a bit, and the other one is more prevalent in the west. However, there are more variants of this that could narrow down the region. So we're very specific about how we name corner shops in German. So if you ask someone to put the money behind the trash can next to the corner shop, then that might be something, again, that we could use as a reference for a sort of criminal investigation. If you happen to use a lot of Swiss German, we might even get to the same kind of narrowing down as we did for Akron in Ohio. So for example, if you use Grüezi, the second variant on the left, this is very marked for Swiss German. Same is true for the right one, which means not, where we could indeed get to sort of a city level profile of someone. So one of the things that you might take away from this lecture today is that never write your ransom note in Swiss German, because that will make us find you. So how to make this useful in a forensic setting is the way. So I've written an app where you can just input the word that you're interested in. So sort of as an advanced dialect dictionary to figure out where people use this word more prevalently. And then that in turn could help the police if they wanted to use this to narrow down their list of suspects. Just as a side note, obviously we don't have data for all of the points, all of the cities in these countries. So what we would usually do, or what I do before I do this kind of analysis, is that I interpolate the map, which means that I use the information that I already have, so where there are a lot of preferences for one variable, and I make an assumption, or the computer helps me make an assumption based on statistics, that in this case, for example, the whole of Austria is probably going to use the purple variant and not the green or yellow variant in this case, so that we have a clearer map of where things are happening. So the thing that I'm currently working on is how to make all of these maps computationally more useful. So far we've done sort of the qualitative analysis where we pick out features that we think are interesting. So I noticed that corner shop might be regionally marked, so I put it into my little program and figure out whether or not it is indeed in regional distribution. But ideally, what I would like to do is sort of reduce the bias that I, as a linguist, bring to the table. Because if I don't know that the devil strip or the corner shop are indeed relevant and look them up, I might not find out that this is actually an important feature for the case. So it very much depends on my expertise and skill level as a linguist to solve the case. And ideally, this should not be the case. So any case that gets analyzed by a forensic linguist should have the same chance of finding the suspect in the case. And that's why I would like to rely a bit more on computational methods to sort of cut out the bias. So the bit that I try to do now is how to combine all of these computationally, all of the things that I know about regional variation, to make a profile that's not just based on my knowledge. And if you look at the first sentence here in this WhatsApp message, which translates to, but really I don't care very much, I can create a map for each of these words. And you can see that there are hotspots for where people in the Yodel corpus use words in this spelling. But the question now for me is, how do I combine all these details or this information into one good profile that actually tells me something about the author? And the way I'm trying to do this is sort of overlaying all of these maps in a scientific and not in a PowerPoint way. And when I do that, I get to the map that you see here on the left. Unweighted just means that I took all the features and combined them equally. And then you can see that with quite some certainty, the author of this WhatsApp message is not from Switzerland. You can't say a lot more about it because unfortunately the rest is quite purpley, maybe not from Northern Germany, but you know, that's as far as we get with these 6 words. The author of this WhatsApp message is originally from the area with the little yellow star. I hope that shows up on the projector for you as well. So it wouldn't be too far off in this case. Now, I know from authorship analysis that function words are quite important. So we often use function words for analysis because they're quite stable across texts. They're not as easy to manipulate as other features. So I thought maybe weighting by function words would be helpful, but as you can see, so it's not the same map, but it's still not Switzerland. That's the kind of result we're getting here. And I've also tried to focus on the nouns, maybe the nouns as the topics, as the cultural aspects, tell me something more about the author, but also this is not helping very much. Now, I know we're only looking at 6 words here, so we're literally just focusing on aber eigentlich ist es mir echt egal. So obviously, if this was a police case, I would never go to the police and say, okay, this is my profile based on the first 6 words of this one WhatsApp message. That's not how it works. But, you know, I'm trying to sort of bring home why this is like, why am I doing this kind of analysis? And the last sort of method that I've stuck with for now is to use a weighting of all of these words, of all of these maps based on Moran's eye. And Moran's eye tells us how regionally bound a word is. So it's sort of the regionality score of a word. And if I weight the 6 words in this WhatsApp message by how regional they are and then combine it into a map, we get a lot clearer messages back from the map. So we have 2 sort of hotspots, 2 centers of where this map would tell us where the author is from. So one would be Innsbruck in Austria, and one would be around Karlsruhe in southern Germany. Now, this was the very first message that I ever worked on for my corpus to do any kind of computational analysis with. And you might believe me or not, because the result of this, so I told you the person was from here, but the person has lived here for the last 15 years of his life. Now, I know this because this is a WhatsApp message from my friend, so I know where he grew up, I know where he lives. And this is also why I used it, because I knew I could ask my friend to, have his message in a PowerPoint presentation, for example. But I think for 6 words, this would have been an amazing guess at where this person's from. Usually, this is not how it works. So I don't think that if I would take the whole of this message, that the result would look similar. So there are a lot of confounding factors here. So don't assume that on 1 sentence in 6 words we can profile where you're from. But this is the start of the kind of idea of where this PhD is going. And what I would like to ultimately be able to do is to then narrow down the list of suspects. So this is not something I would go to court with and say, okay, I would go under oath and tell you that this person is from this city in Germany based on this kind of analysis that I've just presented to you. There's a lot more that's going into that. But to sum up what I've told you today, we've talked about how to avoid perjury, at least in the US, and what it means to lie under oath. We've looked at police statements, and I hope you can appreciate that you need to really understand what you're signing if you're ever in the situation, because it might be that it's not the words that you've actually said that go down into the transcription of the interview at the police station. I've talked about the cases that led to the abolition of the capital punishment for murder in the UK. I hope you never end up saying linguistic fingerprint, because that's not usually what we want to use, and you know why we don't use that. But that we do, in fact, rely on an individual style when we do this kind of analysis. That tricking a linguist in a ransom note is not as easy as you might think. And that there are a lot of really cool research topics within forensic linguistics if you ever want to dive deeper into this at all. In a very formal way, we've talked about forensic linguistics, investigative linguistics, and language and law, and especially about authorship analysis and authorship profiling. Now, the very last slide that I have for you is a couple of names if you're interested. These are the people that I know that do forensic linguistics in Spain. I know that Sheila also works in Catalan and not just in Spanish. For the other 2, I don't know. And that there is a at least Spanish-speaking paper on forensic linguistics. If you want to check that out, obviously take a picture or have the slides later on. And that leaves me saying thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this. And if you have any questions or comments, please let me know.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dana. It's amazing presentation, really so interesting, and the fact that you allow us to be a little like Sherlock Holmes. Today we can borrow the art of Sherlock Holmes. Really was amazing. And if you have any questions or comments.
So I was wondering how artificial intelligence, such as ChatGPT, could impact the world of forensic linguistics, both as a tool and as an obstacle as well, because you may be analyzing an email that's written with ChatGPT or similar.
Yes, I get this question quite a lot at the moment, and I understand why, obviously. So far, at least from what I've known from the work with the police, is that people, in fact, do not use it as much as we would think they do. So the kind of criminal energy that you might think people have, they don't use it, at least not for now, which I guess is good for us in a sense that they haven't figured it out yet. But it is going to be a problem. I think the prevalence of it is only going to rise at this point. So people will, ask it to write a ransom note, for example. Now, the problem with this is that we can figure out if something was written by AI, by a model. So there's a lot of work, not just in forensic linguistics, but generally in natural language processing and figuring out whether or not AI has authored something. But then obviously, other than saying, okay, we think that AI authored this, we can't really do anything. So it might turn out to be a big problem. So I hope that the models, the machines tend to be individuating enough. The good thing is, if you think that this is a good thing, you can sort of reverse engineer from the text. So you can try and figure out what were the prompts that went into the ransom note, the email that ChatGPT wrote, and then work with the prompts as your sort of authorship analysis. But I don't think this is going to work for a long time. So until we get to the point where we can actually use this reliably in forensic linguistics, that's going to be a while. So for now, I hope that people don't think about it or are not as smart about it. So I've tried to ask ChatGPT to obfuscate a text that I've written, and I asked it to translate it into a specific dialect. And I thought this was a quite straightforward task for ChatGPT, and it completely messed it up. So it knew that dialect was a thing, and then it just threw everything on it that it thought was dialect, resulting in it using anything from anywhere. So it was absolutely incoherent in the kind of obfuscation that it did. So that's a good thing. It's not as smart as as people sometimes claim it is. It's still a machine. It's not thinking. But yeah, the ultimate answer is it might be a big problem, but for now we don't see criminals using it. So that's a good thing, I guess.
So I have a question about work field. So I was wondering, I don't know if this is true because we talked about how linked police investigations and forensic linguistics are, but I was wondering if you can do work in forensic linguistics that doesn't involve working with the police or I don't know, separated from police investigations or this type of thing?
I think for quite a big part of people who call themselves forensic linguists, that they end up working at the university. So there are a couple of people who are forensic linguists who work full-time for the police. So for example, for Germany, I know that there's a unit in the federal police where people are employed by the state who work as forensic linguists, but that is very much an exception. And the norm is that as a forensic linguist, you work at universities, and then sometimes you consult, but you don't necessarily have to consult. So especially in contexts where people look at, for example, cases of sexual assault and how the police handles these, there's quite a bit of research into how well or not well the police are handling these. And that's something, for example, you could do where you wouldn't have to necessarily work with the police, but learn something about how the legal system works and then try and help and improve it without ever having to touch that. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Because we had a few weeks ago we had a talk with Sheila Carral, which you mentioned, and she has worked quite closely with the police, and also helping in train police officers to detect things and stuff like that. So I saw that there was work cooperating with the police, but I was wondering about other types of work that wasn't directly involved there. So yeah, thank you.
I think adding to that, if you're worried about where you end up for work, given that all of the social networks use language so much, they might not call it forensic linguistics, but they're definitely interested in the skills that you could bring. So if you don't necessarily want to stay in academia or work with the police, I think there's lots of industry jobs where you could end up working with the skills as a forensic linguist, but you would maybe need to figure out what the names are for the company. So they might call you tactical linguist or You might work on matching people up on dating sites based on their language. So if you make a profile and say that, I don't know, people from this dialect region work well in dating with people from this dialect region. So I'm making this up. I have no clue if this is true. But you see, there are other ways of, you know, using what you've learned that might not be proper forensic in the sense of working with the police.
Hi, Dana, thanks a lot. That was very interesting. I have a clarification question and then another one. First, you said that forensic linguistics is about written language and forensic phonetics about spoken language.
Yeah.
But what about if you have a corpus of spoken language, like, and you don't analyze things like phonetic properties? If you analyze things like how often does this person say this word, and in spoken data, does it fall under forensic phonetics or forensic linguistics?
If you would do this kind of analysis, so say you look at the recording of my talk today and you count the amounts of times I said for example, I would think that is forensic linguistics. That being said, I think if you have a recording of someone, there are things that are a lot more interesting to look at, that would give you a lot more profile information than the kind of forensic linguistic analysis would do. So you could look at the frequency that my voice is in and figure out if my biological gender is more likely this or that. You could figure out how old I am, if I have any kind of speech impairment, for example. So yes, I agree with you that we would probably class this then as linguistics if we count something, for example, but that in a proper forensic case, this would probably go to the forensic phonetician, and then it would already be solved before it came to the forensic linguist.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that makes it clear. And then the other question from, I'm a psychologist, and then I was trying to find a link between forensic linguistics and psychology. And so do you think, so I think it's necessary, for example, if you want to identify some patterns. I mean, if a text is written by someone whose native language is not German, maybe you identify some structures that are not from German, but from another language. But do you think there's still research needed, or there's still some collaboration needed between the two fields, or is there already someone working on that already? Because you might not identify a pattern if you are not aware that a specific language has this pattern.
So that would have been my first thought as well when you said typology. So there is an area that's called Native Language Influence Detection, NLID. And I say a research area that makes it sound like there's tons and tons of work, which there is in fact not. So I know of 3 people who have worked in this. So I would say there's quite a lot of need to figure this out more, especially because I think like the way I presented this to you, where I was looking at German, I think that a lot of the cases will involve people whose first language is not German. And this I don't account for in the kind of regional analysis I'm doing. Obviously, if they learned as their second language some form of dialect of German, then that works. But I think the more important feature would then not be, are they from Munich, but what is their first language? Because that can tell me quite a lot in a kind of investigative context. So there are 3 people that I know of who have worked in this. If you want to get in touch with them to talk about this kind of area, because I think there should be more work on this. The one is called Christoph Credence, and I can put the names in the chat because I'm pretty sure that the spelling might be not what you expect. And the other person where I immediately know the name is Ria Perkins. And I know that there is a Spanish-speaking person as well, and I think her name is Modeno, but I'm not entirely certain. all of these people are in Aston in Birmingham. So the Birmingham is the place to be if you want to do forensic linguistics. It might not be the place where you want to live, but it is where forensic linguistics is.
Then I do have a final question for you about the fact that you had the chance to study in English and in German.
Yeah.
Did you see some pattern that helped you analyze in a general way in these two languages, or there are two different that you say, no, it's not possible?
Yeah, so one of the things that usually people tell you when you get into forensic linguistics is that you work with your first language, because for your first language, you have a sort of intuition, or not necessarily just your first language, but the language that you learned from a very early age and you have an intuition about, and that helps you with these kinds of cases. So when you look at the devil's strip example, it's a lot more easy to figure out that the devil's strip is something relevant if this is a language that you're very used to. So I thought for the longest time that I would work with German, but I think I'm at the level where I can work with both German and English. And I think they are very similar in the kind of features that might come up. So the kind of interpunctuation, how it works, the kind of syntax. Also culturally, most of these countries that have these as first languages are quite similar, so that's not a big influence. My third language is Finnish, which I started learning at a later stage, and that's something I would not be comfortable working in. Like I can read a ransom note and hopefully understand it well enough to be like, okay, maybe there's dialect in here, but I wouldn't want to, you know, go to court on that kind of thing. At least not for now. That would take me another couple of years to get to that point. So yeah.
Really, thank you very much for all the amazing things that you told us today. Really appreciate that, and we hope there will be another chance in the future. So I will finish the talk in Catalan. I will try it at least. Moltes gràcies a Dana Roemling per aquesta xerrada esta tarda, i l'Associació Marcada dels estudiants de lingüística de l'Universitat de Barcelona us dona una bona tarda. Moltes gràcies.